You're watching Study with Sudhir. This is your digital classroom. My name is Sudhir and we are looking at the Chinese statue. This is explanation video number 3, right? In part 1 and part 2, we have gone through the entire story about how the Ming Emperor statue was acquired by Sir Alexander Heathcote, and in part 3, we are going to be told about what his subsequent generations did with this work of art and how did the statue land up at the Sotheby's auction center and what subsequently happens to it. As I said, it has been told in a slightly non-linear fashion. It starts with the Sotheby's auction site and then it goes into flashback and finally it will return back into the auction center. Now, his firstborn, Major James Heathcote, was serving his queen in the Boer War at the time he came into possession of the Ming Emperor. Now, James Heathcote is the son of Sir Alexander Heathcote, who was breathed his last at the age of 70 while he was in Yorkshire. Now, Boer War was fought between Britain and two African republics between 1899 and 1902. Now, this is an important part of history, and if some kind of reference comes to it, you would do well to make a reference to it. The major was a fighting man commissioned with the Duke of Wellington's regiment, and although he had little interest in culture, even he could see the family heirloom was no ordinary treasure. So he loaned the statue to the regimental mess at Halifax in order that the emperor could be displayed in the dining room for his brother officers to appreciate. So obviously it shows a bit about the nature of James Heathcote, that he put it at the regimental mess, the dining room, so that his brother officers, the way other officers are referred to within the army, air force and navy, so that they could also appreciate this work of art. Now, when James Heathcote became colonel of the Dukes, the emperor stood proudly on the table alongside the trophies won at Waterloo and Sebastopol in the Crimea and Madrid. No, so you kind of realize that the importance he's giving to this particular work of art that he has got from his father, right? So he puts it along with the trophies that were won in famous wars like Waterloo. And there the Ming statue remained until the colonel's retirement to his father's house again in Yorkshire, which is a county in England, as I told you, when the emperor returned once again to the drawing room mantelpiece. The colonel was not a man to disobey his late father even in death, and he left clear instructions that the heirloom must always be passed on to the firstborn of the Heathcotes unless the family honor was in jeopardy. Jeopardy essentially means at risk or in danger. Colonel James Heathcote did not die a soldier's death. He simply fell asleep one night by the fire, the Yorkshire post on his lap. So it's almost like a twist of subtle irony that Jeffrey Archer has brought here, that a soldier did not really die a soldier's death. He died while he was reading the newspaper and while he was sitting by the fireside. The colonel's firstborn, the Reverend Alexander Heathcote, was at that time presiding over a small flock in the parish of Muchadam in Hertfordshire, another county. After burying his father with military honors, he placed the little Ming emperor on the mantelpiece of the vicarage. Vicarage is the residence of the vicar, one of the officials at the church. Few members of the Mothers' Union appreciated the masterpiece, but one or two old ladies were heard to remark on its delicate carving. And it was not until the Reverend became the Right Reverend, that is, got promoted as per the church hierarchy, and the little statue found its way into the bishop's palace, that the emperor attracted the admiration he deserved. So when he went into the bishop's house, there obviously more people would come, appreciate the work of art. So obviously it got admired by many more visitors. Many of those who visited the palace and heard the story of how the bishop's grandfather had acquired the Ming statue were fascinated to learn of the disparity between the magnificent statue and its base. It always made a good after dinner story. Please mark these lines because these are important in the context of what unfolds later on in the story. Now you realize that most people hearing the story obviously felt that the statue was much more brilliant than the base. Okay, why I'm asking you to mark it? Because of the context of what happens later on in the story, right? And this is almost Archer's way of kind of keeping the suspense as far as the base and the statue alive and not really preparing you for the twist at the end. God takes his own ambassadors, but he did not do so before allowing Bishop Heathcote to complete a will, leaving the statue to his son, with the grandfather's exact instructions carefully repeated. The bishop's son, Captain James Heathcote, was a serving officer in his grandfather's regiment. So the same regiment as his grandfather, and he also has the same name, James Heathcote. So the Ming statue returned to the mess table in Halifax. So it's going between the bishop's house, Yorkshire, where the house of Sir Alexander was, and the regiment mess. During the emperor's absence, the regimental trophies had been augmented by those struck for Pris, the Maine and Verdun. The regiment was once again at war with Germany, and young Captain James Heathcote was killed on the beaches of Dunkirk and died intestate. Intestate meaning dying without having written out a will, right, as to who will kind of inherit all my wealth. Thereafter, English law, the known wishes of his great-grandfather, and common sense prevailed, and the little emperor came into the possession of the captain's 2-year-old son. So from Alexander Heathcote to James Heathcote, from James Heathcote to Alexander Heathcote to James Heathcote, and now to Alex Heathcote. So in order to make a distinction between the great-grandfather and the great-grandson, you are kind of a great-grandson, sorry, you are being told of Alexander Heathcote and Alex Heathcote. And if I was the examiner, I would probably ask you a question to kind of distinguish between these two people, Alexander Heathcote and Alex Heathcote. So you do well to now note about what kind of a person Alex Heathcote is and how different he is from Sir Alexander Heathcote. So the next paragraph, the few paragraphs are important in that context. Alex Heathcote was alas not of the mettle of his doughty ancestors. Doughty essentially means brave and persistent, and he grew up feeling no desire to serve anyone other than himself. Unlike his ancestors who served the diplomatic service, who served in the army, who served the church, this boy Alex Heathcote had no such desire to serve anyone else but himself. So again, a very sharp contrast to the kind of nature of Sir Alexander Heathcote in particular. Alexander Heathcote, we have already known that he was of a very exact kind of nature given the kind of daily habits he had. We learned that in the first explanation video. And in terms of the Heathcotes, Sir Alexander Heathcote and Alex Heathcote are the two most important characters in this story by Geoffrey Archer. So you should know the characteristics of these two Heathcotes in particular. When Captain James had been so tragically killed, Alexander's mother lavished everything on the boy that her meager income would allow. It did not help, and it was not entirely young Alex's fault that he grew up to be, in the words of his grandmother, and note this, a selfish, spoilt little brat. When Alex left school only a short time before he would have been expelled, he found he could never hold down a job for more than a few weeks. Very surprising and very sharply in contrast with what his ancestors, especially Sir Alexander Heathcote, whose name he took, was, because he moved up the ladder, which is why those lines in explanation video number 1 are important. From his postings in Vienna to America to Calcutta, he had kind of moved up the ladder to reach his posting in China, whereas this boy could never hold on to a job for more than a few weeks. It always seemed necessary for him to spend a little more than he and finally his mother could cope with. The good lady, deciding she could take no more of this life, departed it to join all the other Heathcotes not in Yorkshire, where their family home was, but in heaven. So a very subtle way of humor and irony, in a sense, not humor exactly, very wry humor, if you may put it that way, by Geoffrey Archer. In the swinging 60s, when casinos opened in Britain, young Alex was convinced that he had found the ideal way of earning without actually having to do any work. So he took to gambling. Okay, so he took to gambling, and gambling is an addiction where you put in some money, you always needed to put in more and more money. He developed a system for playing roulette with which it was impossible to lose. He did lose, so he refined the system and promptly lost more, right? He refined the system once again, which resulted in him having to borrow to cover his losses. Why not? If the worst came to the worst, he told himself he could always dispose of the little Ming emperor. So that was almost like his safety wall. That was like something which he knew he always could bank on if he completely ran out of funds. The worst did come to the worst, as each one of Alex's newly refined systems took him progressively into greater debt until the casinos began to press him for payment. So he was getting into more debts gradually. When finally one Monday morning, Alex received an unsolicited call from two gentlemen who seemed determined to collect some £8,000 he owed their masters and hinted at bodily harm if the matter was not dealt with within 14 days. Alex caved in. After all, his great-great-grandfather's instructions had been exact. The Ming statue was to be sold if the family honor was ever at stake. Now, in this particular case, it's not so much of family honor, but his individual problems that are at stake. He has been threatened with bodily harm, that is with physical harm, if he actually did not repay the money, and the money was huge. It was 8,000 pounds that had to be repaid. So he decided that this was an opportune moment, this was the right time for him to dispose of the family heirloom, the Ming statue. Alex took the little emperor off the mantelpiece in his Cadogan Gardens flat and stared down at its delicate handiwork, at least having the grace to feel a little sad at the loss of the family heirloom. He then drove to Bond Street and delivered the mantelpiece to Sotheby's, giving instructions that the emperor should be put up for auction. So he has decided that this is the situation warrants him to actually dispose of the statue of the Ming emperor. The head of the Oriental department, a pale, thin man, appeared at the front desk to discuss the masterpiece with Alex, looking not unlike the Ming statue he was holding so lovingly in his hands. It will take me a few days to estimate the true value of the piece, he purred as in, it's just another way of saying it. I mean, it is the reference to the tone of his voice. But I feel confident on a cursory glance that the statue is as fine an example of PenQ as we have ever had under the hammer that has ever been auctioned. That's no problem, replied Alex, as long as you can let me know what's it worth within 14 days. So he wants to use the money in order to repay the debt of 8,000 pounds. Oh, certainly, replied the expert. I feel sure I could give you a floor price by Friday. Couldn't be better, said Alex. During that week, he contacted all his creditors and without exception, they were prepared to wait and learn the appraisal of the expert. Appraisal as in the whatever conclusion he arrived at as far as the price of the Ming statue was concerned. Alex duly returned to Bond Street on the Friday with a large smile on his face. He knew what his great-great-grandfather had paid for the piece and felt sure that the statue must be worth more than 10,000 pounds. So he believed that he would actually make more than 8,000. He could repay his debt, save his family honor, so to say, and also perhaps indulge in more gambling at the roulette. A sum that would not only yield him enough to cover all his debt, but leave him a little over to try out his new refined system on the roulette table. So Jeffrey Archer almost poking fun at his refined systems that he was constantly trying out at the roulette table. None of that was obviously working. As he climbed the steps of the Sotheby's, Alex silently thanked his great-great-grandfather. He asked the girl on reception if he could speak to the head of the Oriental department. She picked up an internal phone and the expert appeared a few moments later at the front desk with a somber look on his face. Somber as in something which is sad and serious looking. Okay, Alex's heart sank as he listened to his words. A nice little piece, your emperor, but unfortunately a fake. So he reveals to Alex that the emperor's statue was actually a fake, not an original. Probably about 250 years old, but only a copy of the original. I am afraid. So it has been copied from the statue which was originally perhaps made by PenQ, but this one was a fake. Copies were often made because he interrupts him. How much is it worth? 700 pounds, 800 at the most. So instead of 10,000 pounds that he was dreaming of getting, he would get not more than 700 to 800 pounds. Enough to buy a gun and some bullets, thought Alex sardonically as he turned and started to walk away. Bullets means, this is now worth me getting shot because he's already been threatened with physical bodily harm by the people who he has taken money from. So sardonically again means something, very sad and almost sarcastically that, I could just have these bullets shot into my head. I wonder, sir, continued the expert. And what do you want me to do with the base? Yes, sell the bloody thing, said Alex without bothering to look back. And what do you want me to do with the base? The base, repeated Alex, turning around to face the Orientalist. Yes, the base. It's quite magnificent. 15th century, undoubtedly a work of genius. I can't imagine how. Lot number 103 announced the auctioneer. So now it has gone back to the auction room. What am I bid for this magnificent example of, and then it goes on. The expert turned out to be right in his assessment. At the auction of Sotheby's that Thursday morning, I obtained the little emperor for 720 guineas. This is the narrator. And the base that was acquired by an American gentleman for not unknown parentage. So it's obviously someone who is very well known, and he buys it for 22,000 pounds. So the guinea and the pound were equivalent at that time. So the base is actually something which is an original piece of craft that fetches him 22,000 pounds, whereas the statue of the emperor goes for only 720, as was explained by the expert person. Now it shows you something. What does it really indicate? Did the Chinese craftsman really know that the base was more expensive? It does not, or more valuable. It doesn't really seem so, because perhaps in that case he would not have been so matter of fact about it. So it's quite possible that the Chinese and the Mandarin interpreter also perhaps did not know. So basically the theme of the story that you need to be mindful of, need to be aware of, is the theme of appearance versus reality. What appears to be valuable may not be valuable. What appears to be not valuable may actually turn out to be much more precious and expensive. Okay, it also, the other theme is the love towards for art and craft and traditions and culture and antique items. And in this particular case, the theme of appearance versus reality is shown in the manner in which the Chinese statue, which was thought to be an original piece of art, turns out to be a fake. So many a times what Jeffrey Archer is trying to convey is how what seems on the face of it, because there are so many people through generations had seen it, none of them could make out that this one was actually not an original piece of work but a fake, right? So and the base, which everyone was obviously ignoring, and also notice the difference between the base and the statue, was the one which was an original piece of craft, which ended up going in for a much higher sum of money. The love of art is obviously something which is very common to obviously the narrator, because he is part of the auction, Alexander Heathcote, as well as the Chinese sculptor Yung Li. Now it also talks about the value of tradition, because the Chinese want to honor their tradition. The Chinese craftsman will not do something unless it is part of his tradition, and he would want, if someone comes to his home, a visitor, and expresses a desire for something, he would go out of his way to actually gift him that particular in this case work of art. Similarly, Alexander Heathcote also goes out of his way to ensure that he also stays true to the Chinese tradition, that he should repay the debt within the same calendar year. So the whole trying to stay true to traditions, Chinese traditions, is something which is a theme which runs through this particular story. And also Alex Heathcote, using what Sir Alexander Heathcote had written in his will, that unless the family honor was in jeopardy, the emperor's statue should not be disposed of. He interpreting it as that his whole financial problems was a case of his family honor being in danger, and therefore deciding to dispose of the statue at the auction in Sotheby's. So as I said, celebration of history, celebration of culture, celebration of Chinese customs and traditions, and that is what this whole story is about. So these two themes, and the contrast between the great-great-grandfather and the great-great-grandson is something which you should know as far as this story is concerned. This was part of Jeffrey Archer's collection, A Quiver Full of Arrows, which is another one of his very famous works. I hope you have understood this particular story. So a lot of details are in this particular story which you should underline and keep in mind and quote from the story when you are attempting a question from this particular story. Thank you very much for watching.